Geico presents sharing versus oversharing. Earlier this week, Claire Tippins shared a princess nickname generator, 3 pictures of her dog wearing a tutu, and 2 online quizzes, including what candy is your dream castle made of? Claire, your sharing has tipped the sugar scale and turned into oversharing. But have no fear, princess. Geico has something worth sharing with your internet kingdom, like how you could save hundreds on your car insurance just by visiting geico.com. No magic wand required. Geico, 15 minutes could save you 15% or more on car insurance.
Blog Talk Radio.
Hello and welcome to SBPRA Radio. I'm your host, Patrick Morgan, and today I'm speaking with author Barry Hammer. Mr. Hammer, do I have you on the line?
Yes, you do, Patrick.
Oh, how are you doing today, Barry?
Very good, and looking forward to the interview.
Good,
I'm
good.
I'm
excited to have you to share your infinite wisdom.
Yes, I'm going to share my infinite font of wisdom with the listeners.
Awesome, awesome. Well, I'm sure they're eager to hear, and I'm excited, too, that this is a 3-part interview. So for those of you listeners out there who aren't aware, we're going to be conducting 3 interviews all at the same time that we're doing it right now. As a matter of fact, 2 p.m. Eastern today, tomorrow, and then on Wednesday as well. So this will be a 3-part radio interview series, which will be a real treat. So let's just get started, first of all, by it's my understanding that you just released, is it 2 books?
Yes. Both books are based on one manuscript that my dad left me called The Psychology of Self-Growth. And I decided to break it up after my dad passed away in June of 2011. I decided to break it up into 2 books, one dealing with psychological self-understanding, and the other one dealing with relationship to other people. And the psychological self-understanding book is now entitled Psychological Healing through Creative Self-Understanding and Self-Transformation. And the book dealing with human relationship is now entitled Deepening Your Personal Relationships, Developing Emotional Intimacy and Good Communication.
Well, which one would you like to tackle first?
I think it could work either way. I guess it'd probably depend on what the reader would like to, what the listener would be most interested in.
Well, let's start with the self first of all, because we do have three opportunities, as I mentioned, to kind of continue on with these conversations, which is perfect, especially since we'll be doing this with 2 books. Well, let's start with the first one. What did you say the title was again?
Yes, the title is Psychological Healing through Creative Self-Understanding and Self-Transformation.
Gotcha. Well, actually, I want to, if you don't mind, Barry, I want to back up even a second before, because you said that you broke this into 2 books.
Yes.
But the images for these 2 books came from a manuscript that your father gave you. Explain a little bit more about that.
Yes, well, my father, Dr. Max Hammer, was a psychology professor at the University of Maine from about 1961 till he retired in 1990. And as part of his work as a professor at the university, he taught a course called Mental Hygiene, which was not like dental hygiene to clean out your teeth or clean out your mind, brainwash, but rather the opposite, to help people kind of overcome conditionings, to break off shackles of all kind of social controls and self-controls, and to get more in touch with their authentic self. So he wrote basically a workbook as a kind of a self-made textbook for students, giving them a number of experiential exercises to help them reflect on issues related to self-understanding and human relationship. And I believe it was called The Psychology of Self-Growth. And after my dad passed away, actually before he passed away, he asked me to finish that manuscript for him. And as I looked over the manuscript, it occurred to me there was so much material, it would probably be unwieldy for one book, because each of the current books, the psychological healing book is now like about 550 pages, and the other book on human relationship is over 400 pages. Plus, I felt that basically they each should be a book in their own right, because although they're related topics, and I recommend that people get both books, but the book on psychological healing does deal more with relationship to self-understanding, and self-transformation, whereas the other book on human relationship really deals more with relationships to others. Of course, they're related processes, because as you deepen your own self-understanding, you have more authenticity, more real energy with which to relate to others. And as you relate to others more authentically, you develop a more self-understanding. They're really kind of reciprocal processes, like breathing, like inhalation and exhalation. They're really mutually enhancing. So they can't really be divided. In each book, I really talk, I really cross-reference, ideas. But I thought that, there should be two distinct books that emphasize, the different aspects.
Yeah, well, it makes a lot of sense to break it down that way, but that is an important note that, while they're two separate sort of, just in terms of sheer size, too, we're dealing with two very, very large books, but that they are kind of related and that they go hand in hand. And I love that analogy of breathing, that it's inhalation, exhalation. It's two separate things, but it's all part of one same process. I'm curious, Barry, if I can ask you about both yourself and I guess from your father. You're both doctors. So if you could tell me a little bit about, maybe start with your father and his background in terms of his education or what he did for the majority of his life, and then kind of let that flow into your own background, just so we can get a sense of not your credentials, not that anyone's doubting that, but just sort of what your background is, I suppose.
It's fine. Yes, my dad, Dr. Max Hammer, was born in 1930, and he was born in the Bronx, New York. And he came from a very poor family. His parents were immigrants from Eastern Europe. We were actually a Jewish family. And basically, it was very hard for my dad growing up, because he grew up in the Great Depression, and his father was often unemployed. And he had to learn to be very strong in character in order to deal with repeated evictions from their apartment because they couldn't pay the rent. And my dad had to help his father, get some money, because his father couldn't really support the family on his own. So my dad had to shine shoes, for example, had to moonlight, other jobs in the evening. So my dad, grew up kind of trying to understand, how do you develop strength of character? How do you develop courage? How do you develop, the ability to handle, all the stress that life can bring? And my dad grew up kind of lonely, too, because growing up in the Bronx, there was a lot of, ruffians, a lot of bullies, and he didn't find too many people that he could relate to, who would talk about the kind of, deeper, soulful things that he was into. So basically, as he grew up, his parents suggested that he become a businessman because they wanted him to have a good income like they didn't have. And my dad actually worked for a few days in a kind of commercial business, and he said he wanted to throw up, that he just felt so nauseated by all the phoniness and artificiality. None of the business has to entirely be that way, but he just couldn't live out that kind of...
personally, it wasn't what worked.
Yeah, he just wasn't made for it. So what happened was that he couldn't really afford a college education because he came from a very poor family, but fortunately there was one college in New York City called City College that had free education for gifted but poor youth. So he got basically a free education at City College, and he happened to take a course in psychology. And one of the professors, called him, after class and said, Max, I can see from the comments you make in class that you're very empathic. You really care about people. You really have a very great, sincere desire to understand people, to understand yourself, to understand how to liberate people from psychological pain. I think you should really consider becoming a psychotherapist. And when his professor said that, it just kind of clicked with my dad. He just kind of intuitively felt that it felt right for him. And when he was younger, he never heard of psychotherapists. That it was kind of an unknown phenomenon, but it just kind of felt really right for him. So he what happened was he got a master's degree in psychology at I think it was Iowa. and then he went to pursue his doctoral studies at the University of North Dakota in Grand Forks, and that's where I was born. He married my mom about a year or two earlier. They later got divorced, and that's an interesting issue too. Like, my dad being divorced, I guess he wanted to understand what makes a good relationship work and what doesn't. Because he didn't. Either my parents, well, they really found their true soulmate, and so they, there's a kind of an added issue of suffering. And then basically what happened was that my dad was given a job at the University of Maine and a nearby private counseling center as well in Maine when I was about 3 years old. And he found that in his because he was also a psychotherapist as well as a professor of psychology, and he found that whether teaching students academically or counseling people one-on-one, because he basically used his classes as a kind of group psychotherapy dynamic, he found that it's very, very important to really help people kind of shed their psychological masks and kind of get in touch with the real them, their real energy, their real experience, not kind of stylized poses, what they think they should be, what he called the self-image, but rather the more experiential self, and beyond the experiential self, what he called the transpersonal self, that which is innate, that which is not conditioned or dependent on positive and negative, pleasant or unpleasant experiences, what is more part of our timeless being. So basically, he, in collaboration with one of his colleagues, Dr. Alan Butler, who contributed to the original manuscript, they together wrote a kind of an experiential manuscript to help students do certain kind of reflective exercises, try to understand themselves, try to understand other people, try to understand the society in which they live, try to take more responsibility for resolving their own psychological pain, and following kind of the thread of their own experience until it leads them to the essential level of their being, the spiritual level. You see, my dad was always a very spiritual person, but he said that he didn't grow up with a lot of spirituality in his home. His parents were not really that spiritually inclined, but just as he followed his own experience, it kind of led him to intuit that there's a very grand nature in the core of our being, a nature of love, a nature of goodness, a nature of beauty, deep inner peace, a kind of inner treasure chest, or like a seed that is kind of meant to develop into a mature tree or a mature flower. And he felt somehow a sense of calling in life, a sense of purpose to help himself and others break free of any kind of stuckness or what he calls fixation that blocks them from developing or actualizing their potential so they can be fully alive by developing all that life has naturally gifted them to be, which includes certain individual potentials, but also certain potentials that are relational to others, that as we relate to others, it helps us develop certain related aspects of our own being.
Barry, let me ask you a question real quick, if you don't mind. I want to ask specifically about this process, and I think the term you used before is a psychotherapist. Is that correct?
Yes. My dad was licensed as a psychotherapist, and he also was an academic teacher of psychology. But even in his work as a professor, he didn't really like lecturing too much. He basically made his class basically like a kind of a group therapy session. He also was an instructor to graduate students in the psychotherapy program, kind of training graduate students to become psychotherapists. And one way in which he differed from a lot of his colleagues is that his colleagues tended to take a kind of a theoretical framework. That some were Freudian, some were Jungian, some were behaviorists, like B.F. Skinner, for example. And my dad disagreed with that. He said that it's important not to be locked into any kind of abstract, preconceived, pre-committed theoretical framework, but rather to be empathic communion with the client in terms of their here and now experience. And when you are deeply invested as a therapist in communion with the client, their own energy, their own experience will sort of leap out at you and will kind of unfold its own story. So my dad was not really too scientific in his approach. He wasn't into kind of a lot of technique. Rather, he kind of was more, he kind of went by feel, kind of more artistically. He sort of empathically tuned into his clients as a therapist, and that's what he taught his graduate students to do also.
Well, I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. I'm certainly I'm not an expert in this field at all, But, just even from being an objective outsider, I think there's a lot to be said for sort of fitting the method to the individual we're in question, rather than just trying to adhere to some sort of strict, orthodox, uniform procedure or anything like that. It's more important to kind of gauge what might work for the individual. And I was going to ask you in terms of, the work, I guess, behind being a psychotherapist. And that's so interesting that you said it was less, for your dad at least, it was less lecture. It was more sort of a group therapy session. And I wanted to ask about the specifics of like what this work actually constitutes, because obviously I can see how the trap is it could get very, very academic and kind of get wrapped up in theory rather than actual practice. So how do you avoid that?
Yes, well, basically it involves seeing beyond what my dad called the self-concept or the self-image, what he called the persona. A persona is like an ancient Greek a theatrical device. It was kind of a mask that people wore in the theater to take on a certain identity. So, for example, in the Greek, was going to represent the god Zeus or another god or goddess. They would wear a mask to represent that particular god or demon. But that took people away from their own real face, their own real energy. So basically, what my dad did was he did certain reflect exercises that help students distinguish between things that they think about themselves, certain ideas they have of themselves, and what is actually arising in them in the here and now moment in terms of energy, and also to help them be more alert to not labeling or defining other people, but to tune into what the other person is actually experiencing and feeling empathically. So he devised various exercises to help the students to reflect on that.
Now, for you, growing up, and you mentioned that he was married for a while to, was that your mom?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so they were married, and then at a certain point they divorced. I want to ask you specifically from an early age, just being, because obviously a lot of people don't have a father who's a psychotherapist or involved with this sort of this theory and the practice and everything. What was your childhood like? Because I think that must be so fascinating, and obviously you followed down a similar sort of career path and finished this book for him. But I can tell, even just from speaking to you for the last 15, 20 minutes, that you're obviously a very educated man and someone who's passionate about this field. So I want to ask, how did living with your father sort of influence that and help that passion to sort of begin?
Yes, well, I always had a very close relationship with my father. That he used to like to take walks with me because we live in a little town where there's a lot of kind of nature trails and nice places to walk. We also walked on campus, and he would always ask me to bring a notebook with me. And when we were walking, he would suddenly get ideas about psychology, and he would ask me to write down in my little notebook his ideas about psychology. And then he would take me to his office in the psychology department, and he would have me tear off the pages and add them to, like, he had a whole collection, kind of like a mountains and mountains of notebooks where he kind of stored his psychological ideas. He really had a sense of purpose. He was very dedicated. He felt that the purpose of his life was to help people free themselves from psychological blocks, psychological pain, psychological conflict, to not be kind of stuck like a broken phonograph record, but rather to be free to be their whole self. And so I guess that having bonded with my dad that way, I did feel very close to him. And we talked not only about his psychology ideas, but we talked about politics. So I was always very interested in politics and history. I wasn't really that much into sports. I guess maybe it was a little bit hard for my dad to bring me up in some ways because I was maybe mildly autistic. I don't know if I had Asperger's or something, but I guess I was very socially withdrawn. I was into fantasy a lot. I was a very imaginative person by nature. It was hard for my dad to kind of entice me into reality. So I had a lot of social problems growing up. I got bullied a lot, beaten up by other boys. I got ridiculed a lot because I was kind of goofy. I was kind of spaced out a little bit. I didn't get to very good grades when I was growing up because I just, I was very intelligent, but I just wasn't very motivated to work hard in school. So
Right.
I guess part of my dad's psychological development was in order to try to help mentor me, to help me kind of get out of this funk, and not, waste my potential, help me to kind of, get a good education and a good job. He had to motivate me to work hard. He had to motivate me to kind of get more into reality. So I think that kind of working with me, along with his other clients, kind of helped him also. But in terms of my own development, I didn't really decide to become a psychologist. I mean, I recognized my dad was doing very good work, but as he often told me, that we all have our own kind of natural blueprint. We all have our own natural talents, and we're not meant to try to be clones or Xerox copies of anyone else. He understood that we all have to develop, the kind of unique potentials that life has given us. And so I moved more into history. I moved, and I was interested in understanding basically the ethos of a culture, like what makes, for example, this civilization of China what it is, in terms of their values, and in terms of their creative arts, and in terms of their form of government. So I tried to understand basically the soul of different regions of the world. The soul. I was especially interested in Asian culture. I became interested in European, ancient Greco-Roman, and medieval history, and basically. After getting a bachelor's degree in history from the University of Maine, I wanted to understand more the soul of different cultures. So I decided to take a master's program at Harvard Divinity School in the history of religion. So basically, still history, but how different religions shape the historical development of different parts of the world. And then I got my doctoral studies at the Graduate Theological Union, where I decided to specialize in Judaism. And as I say, my family has some Jewish background, but we didn't really grow up. My dad and mom were not really that much into Judaism, but I started reading the philosophy of Martin Buber, where he talked about the I-thou relationship. He said that basically when you're in caring communion with another person, you tap into a level of reality that you can't access by yourself alone. And he also wrote about hallowing the everyday, that every aspect of ordinary life is meant to be treated as very special and precious. And he talked about the Kabbalah, the idea in Judaism that we have to be in a kind of state of receptivity. We have to be attuned to a kind of a higher blueprint, like a kind of architectural design that we're meant to grow into, and the whole world is meant to grow into. And this really intrigued me. I felt somehow that there's a certain level of reality that is meant to be very collaborative, where we join forces with other individuals in a kind of synergistic connection, where we join forces with a kind of great unconscious mystery, maybe the divine. There's kind of a partnership vertically and horizontally between person and person, and between humanity and what is invisible. And so I guess I kind of felt that I was meant to sort of balance my dad. He's more interested in individual psychology and relationship, where I was more interested in social psychology. I was more interested in cultures and history and the future of humanity. I somehow felt that I was meant to contribute to the future destiny of humanity. And in both of my books, both of my dad's books, I do discuss my own view of the future of humanity, especially in the last chapter of the other book, Deepening Your Personal Relationships, where the last appendix deals with applying the principles of optimal human relationship to bettering society. So that's kind of my angle.
Well, I was going to ask you, just because, you mentioned that your dad was sort of more interested, I think you said, in the individual sort of psychosis and everything, and you had to kind of choose. I mean, not that it's one against the other. Obviously, it all is fascinating. It all interests you, but you were more interested from a sort of social science perspective and how human beings interact with one another. My question was going to be, in terms of the two books, how you broke them down, psychological healing to create a self-understanding, self-transformation. You mentioned that that's more about the self and, understanding the self. It's in the title. Whereas the second book, Deepening Personal Relationships, that's more about, interconnectivity. I was going to ask you I'm not trying to ask you to pitch yourself, for one book over the other, but is the second book kind of more I don't know if precious is the right word, but since you did say that that's kind of more your forte as opposed to your dad's, is there more of you in the second book as opposed to the first, or is it pretty well balanced throughout?
I think it's pretty well balanced. I mean, I feel that each book is a labor of love. That my dad always asked me to be in kind of a state of empathic communion with him, because he felt that when we're really attuned to each other, not only me and him, but any two individuals or an individual in communion with their activities, that creative functioning is enhanced. And so my dad, for example, is very much interested in sports. He cheered for all the New England teams, the New England Patriots, the Boston Red Sox, the New England Celtics. And even when he was on his deathbed, he still had me run off articles on the internet about the latest sports trades. He was very motivated to understand, what helps people to function as a team, because he basically had a slogan that teamwork wins. If we learn how to function as a team, we will overcome a lot of suffering, a lot of limitation. We'll step into our full power, into our full abundance. So basically, both books talk about how do you tap into the relational core of your own being, where you have more power, more intelligence, more creativity, more well-being, and when you're not so easily victimized by unconscious inner and outer forces that want to basically be like predators on you. So I think that both books, really kind of balance each other out that way in terms of, discussing the same issues from kind of different angles.
Right. Well, believe it or not, Barry, we're almost out of time for our first interview, which is incredible how quickly the time can go. But this is perfect because, I didn't really have this planned as far as how we're going to break it up. But I think this was great today so far because
I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, well, to spend time talking about your background and everything, and to sort of talk about your father. I think if it's all right with you, tomorrow we can focus more. We can start with the first book and really kind of exploring the psychological healing through creative self-understanding, self-transformation, really kind of begin with the self and really dive into that book. And then on Wednesday, we can focus on the second book. And that kind of is just a natural breakdown for how these three interviews might commence, if that's all right with you.
Great. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, well, thank you again for coming on the show today.
Okay. So is this the end of our first session?
Well, yeah, I've got about 3 minutes left in the stream. So I guess if there's any closing thoughts that you want to say, just in terms of your background, in terms of your relationship, I don't know if you want to mention anything about your relationship with your mother, or, you kind of walked us through a lot about your father and into your education. I guess this last 3 minutes is yours to use however you'd wish.
Sure. Well, I just want to give the analogy of a kind of a treasure hunt that my dad felt that we have within us like a kind of inner treasure chest, story of the Wizard of Oz, that we're searching for this kind of very glowing, rich, abundant nature of our being. And in this story of the Wizard of Oz, we have to kind of follow the yellow brick road home to our own true self. That as we live with integrity, and in the psychologically healing book, I discuss what integrity means. As we live with authenticity, and as we relate to other people in the same way, we come more into our own power. We come more into our full greatness. And in the psychologically healing book, I deal at length, especially in some of the appendixes, with how do you tap into enhanced creative functioning by being open to what is beyond current knowledge, being open to mystery. And in addition to my dad, my mom had contributed to my development in other ways too. I think, my dad would tend to be more reality-oriented. I think my mom, like me, is probably more imaginative. And I think that I've been dealing with a lot of inner conflict in terms of trying to integrate the more reality-oriented, the more imaginative aspects of my being. So I think that one thing that I'd like to kind of leave the listeners with is that we all have our own kind of issues of our sore spots, things that are kind of hard for us, our particular challenges, our weak points, as well as our strong points. And I'd like to make this invite listeners, who really want to learn about themselves, kind of get our books, because I think it will help them to be part of this journey of exploration. That these books are really pitched to people who enjoy not having prearranged answers, for people who are open to uncertainty, people who are open to adventure, to discovery. Like Christopher Columbus, he was willing to go beyond the known homeland into an unknown land. Or in the Bible, Abraham was told by God, go from your homeland, go from your father's house, and go to an unknown land that I will show you. We all have this kind of inner beacon, this inner lighthouse, this inner GPS system that's trying to guide us beyond what we already know, beyond our comfort zone to something new. So I think that anybody who kind of wants to be part of that quest, these are your books.
I certainly do. So I mean, you've got me sold, and I mean, like I said, we're just 10 seconds left, unfortunately, and we can run a little bit over. But I just wanted to say, I think that's really wonderful, sort of the mix of reality and fantasy. And I think we're definitely living in an age. There are a lot of people who are still very closed off, and it's sort of our duty to try and keep opening our minds and opening our hearts and our spirits to one another, and also to progress and a more forward thinking. But I do think that, as time goes on, we continue to move closer and closer to that. There are more and more people who are opening it up, or opening themselves up and to one another, and who aren't allowing themselves to kind of be shut off by things such as close-mindedness or, sometimes too strict religious or social doctrination, which is really encouraging.
Yes, it's like people are kind of letting go of the mental tapes, the kind of prepared answers. They're getting more in touch with their own experience. They're opening up, truly tuning into others, and the thing very alive that happens when people do that is exciting.
Yeah,